Sarah Matthews sat in the corner of the crowded coffee shop, her fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. The morning rush hour buzzed around her, but she felt completely alone. Her phone buzzed with another notification from the company's HR department, requesting yet another meeting about her performance issues. She knew what it really meant. They thought she was lying about her condition. At 28, Sarah looked perfectly healthy to everyone who saw her. Her auburn hair fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, and her green eyes still held their spark despite the exhaustion that seemed to follow her everywhere. She dressed professionally for her job at Morrison & Associates, a prestigious marketing firm in downtown Chicago, but lately, even putting on her work clothes felt like climbing a mountain. The problem wasn't visible. That was the curse of her condition. When Sarah told people she lived with chronic pain, they would look at her with skeptical eyes. Where were the crutches? The wheelchair? The obvious signs of suffering? Instead, they saw a young woman who sometimes moved slowly, who occasionally winced when she thought no one was looking, and who had started calling in sick more frequently over the past year. Another migraine, Sarah, her supervisor, Janet, had said just yesterday with barely concealed irritation. Maybe you should see a doctor about these frequent headaches. If only Janet knew that Sarah had seen 17 doctors in the past 3 years. Neurologists, rheumatologists, pain specialists, psychiatrists, the list went on and on. Each appointment brought the same result: inconclusive tests, shoulder shrugs, and suggestions that maybe she should try yoga or meditation. The phrase, "it's probably stress," had become a cruel joke in her life. The pain had started during her senior year of college. At first, she thought it was just the stress of finals and job hunting. But graduation came and went, and the pain remained. It wasn't constant. That might have been easier to explain. Instead, it came in waves, like electrical storms in her nervous system. Some days she felt normal, even energetic. Other days, the simplest tasks felt impossible. Her family had been supportive at first. Her mother, Linda, had driven her to countless appointments, holding her hand in waiting rooms and taking notes during consultations. Her father, Robert, had researched specialists and paid for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. But, as months turned into years with no clear diagnosis, even their patience began to wear thin. Maybe you need to push through it more, her mother had suggested gently during their last phone call. Sometimes when we focus too much on pain, it gets worse. Sarah had hung up feeling more isolated than ever. The people who loved her most were beginning to doubt her too. At work, things had gotten progressively worse. When she first joined Morrison & Associates 2 years ago, she had been their rising star. Her campaign for a local restaurant chain had won industry awards, and clients specifically requested her input on their projects. But, as her bad days became more frequent, her reputation began to suffer. She had tried to hide it at first. On mornings when her body felt like it was made of broken glass, she would force herself to dress professionally and show up with a smile. She learned to make excuses for her slower movements, her occasional need to sit down during presentations, and the days when concentration felt impossible. "Sarah, you seem distracted lately," her colleague Mark had mentioned during a team meeting last week. "Are you sure you're fully committed to the Henderson project?" The question had stung because Sarah was committed. She cared deeply about her work, but some days her brain felt wrapped in cotton. The fibromyalgia, for that's what she suspected she had, though no doctor had confirmed it, affected more than just her muscles and joints. It clouded her thinking, disrupted her sleep, and made her feel like she was living life through a thick fog. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah had woken up feeling relatively good, which always filled her with cautious optimism. She arrived at work early, determined to catch up on the projects that had been suffering due to her recent struggles. But, by mid-morning, the familiar tingling sensation began creeping up her spine. By lunch, she could barely type without her hands cramping painfully. She had powered through until 3 o'clock, when Janet called her into the conference room. Also present was HR Director Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her 50s who viewed sick days as personal failures. "Sarah, we need to discuss your recent performance," Janet began, her voice carefully neutral. "You've used 12 sick days in the past 2 months, and your productivity has declined significantly." Sarah tried to explain, as she had many times before, about her ongoing health issues. She mentioned the doctor visits, the tests, the unsuccessful treatments. But she could see in their faces the same skeptical look she had grown to recognize everywhere. "Have you considered that this might be psychological?" Patricia interjected. "Sometimes young people experience physical symptoms when they're struggling with work-life balance or personal issues." The suggestion hit Sarah like a slap. She wasn't making this up. She wasn't seeking attention or trying to avoid work. She was fighting an invisible battle every single day, and now her employers were suggesting it was all in her head. "I understand this is difficult," Janet continued, "but we need to discuss a performance improvement plan. If you can't meet the expectations of this position, we may need to consider other options." Sarah left the meeting feeling defeated. The performance improvement plan was essentially a countdown to termination. She had 90 days to prove she could handle her job duties, despite dealing with a medical condition that no one seemed to believe was real. That evening, she sat in her small apartment, staring at the stack of medical bills on her coffee table. The treatments, the specialists, the medications that didn't work, it had all cost her thousands of dollars and brought her no closer to answers. Worse, it seemed like the more she sought help, the more people doubted her. She thought about her grandfather, William Matthews, who had passed away when she was 15. He had been a military man, a decorated veteran who had served in Vietnam and, later in Desert Storm. Sarah remembered how he used to tell her stories about the soldiers he had known, men and women who had faced impossible odds and found ways to persevere. Sometimes, "Little Bird," he used to call her, the strongest battles are the ones no one else can see. At the time, she thought he was talking about emotional struggles or moral challenges. Now she wondered if he had understood something about invisible suffering that she was only beginning to grasp. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her best friend since college, Jessica, calling from Seattle where she worked as a nurse. "How did the meeting go?" Jessica asked, her voice warm with concern. Sarah filled her in on the day's events, trying to keep the despair out of her voice. Jessica listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and offering support. As a medical professional, she was one of the few people in Sarah's life who truly believed in the reality of invisible illnesses. "You need to document everything," Jessica advised. "Keep records of your symptoms, your doctor visits, your attempts to get help. If they try to fire you for a medical condition, that could be discrimination." Sarah appreciated the advice, but part of her was simply tired of fighting. She was exhausted from explaining herself, from justifying her pain, from trying to prove that her struggles were real. Some days, she wondered if it would be easier to just give up, to find a less demanding job, and to stop trying to convince people that invisible illnesses were valid. But another part of her, the part that remembered her grandfather's stories about resilience, refused to surrender. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked tired, but not dramatically different from any other young professional dealing with work stress. That was the cruel irony of her situation. She looked like someone who should be able to handle anything life threw at her. She thought about the small tattoo on her shoulder blade, hidden beneath her professional clothes. It was a simple design, a semicolon with small wings, that she had gotten on her 25th birthday. To most people, it would seem like a random artistic choice. But, for Sarah, it represented something deeper, the decision to continue her story when it would have been easier to end it. The semicolon tattoo had originated as a symbol for suicide prevention, representing the choice to continue living when you could have ended your sentence. Sarah had gotten it during a particularly dark period when the pain and isolation had made her question whether life was worth living. The wings were her own addition, symbolizing the hope that someday she would rise above her circumstances. As she traced the outline of the tattoo through her pajama shirt, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let the doubters and skeptics convince her that her pain wasn't real. She would find a way to prove what she was going through, and she would find people who understood. She had no idea that her opportunity to do exactly that was just weeks away, or that it would come from the most unexpected source, a chance encounter with someone who had known her grandfather better than she ever realized. The next morning brought another difficult day at work. The pain was manageable, but the atmosphere in the office had shifted. Sarah could feel her colleagues watching her, evaluating her every move for signs of weakness or deception. Some were sympathetic, offering to help with projects or checking if she needed anything. Others seemed irritated by what they perceived as special treatment for someone who looked perfectly healthy. During lunch, she overheard a conversation between two co-workers in the break room. "I don't know what's wrong with Sarah lately," one said. "She seems fine when she wants to be, but then, suddenly, she needs to leave early or can't handle her regular assignments." "Maybe she's just trying to get attention," the other replied. "Some people do that, you know. Create drama to make themselves seem important." Sarah slipped away before they could see her, but their words followed her for the rest of the day. Was that really what people thought of her? That she was faking illness for attention or special treatment? The accusation was particularly painful because Sarah had spent her entire adult life trying to be self-sufficient and strong. She had worked 2 jobs to pay for college, had graduated with honors, and had built a promising career through hard work and determination. The last thing she wanted was to be seen as someone who couldn't handle responsibility or who needed constant accommodation. But, as she sat at her desk, struggling to focus on the marketing proposal she was supposed to be writing, Sarah realized that she was facing a choice. She could continue trying to hide her condition, pushing through the pain and hoping that somehow things would get better on their own. Or she could take a different approach, one that involved being more open about her struggles and actively seeking the support she needed. The decision scared her. Being open meant risking even more skepticism and judgment. But hiding wasn't working either. In fact, it was slowly destroying her career and her sense of self-worth. As the workday ended, Sarah made another decision. She would start documenting everything, as Jessica had suggested. Every symptom, every doctor's appointment, every day when pain made normal activities difficult. She would build a case for her own reality, armed with evidence and determination. She had no way of knowing that within a few weeks, she would meet someone who would not only believe her story but would reveal a connection to her past that would change everything. The validation she was desperately seeking was closer than she imagined, waiting in the form of an elderly man with military bearing and eyes that seemed to see through surface appearances to the truth beneath. For now, though, Sarah could only take one day at a time, holding on to the hope that somewhere out there, someone would understand that the battles no one could see were often the hardest ones to fight. 3 weeks had passed since the performance improvement plan meeting, and Sarah felt like she was walking on thin ice that grew more fragile with each passing day. Her documentation project had become both a lifeline and a source of additional stress. Each evening, she meticulously recorded her symptoms, energy levels, and pain scores on a scale of 1 to 10. The numbers painted a stark picture of her daily reality, very few days rated below a 5 for pain, and many climbed into the 7 and 8 range. The weather had turned colder, which seemed to make everything worse. Sarah had read that many people with fibromyalgia experienced increased symptoms during weather changes, but this knowledge didn't make the reality any easier to bear. She found herself moving more slowly in the mornings, taking longer to warm up both literally and figuratively. At Morrison & Associates, the atmosphere remained tense. Janet had been monitoring Sarah's work more closely, often stopping by her desk to check on project progress. While she maintained a professional demeanor, Sarah could sense the underlying skepticism. Patricia from HR had scheduled weekly check-ins, ostensibly to offer support but clearly to document any perceived shortcomings. "How are you feeling this week, Sarah?" Patricia asked during their latest meeting, her pen poised over a legal pad as if ready to record evidence of malingering. "I'm managing," Sarah replied carefully. She had learned to avoid giving too much detail about her symptoms, as specificity seemed to invite more doubt rather than understanding. "That's good to hear. Janet mentioned you completed the Morrison Automotive campaign on schedule. That's exactly the kind of consistency we need to see." Sarah nodded, not mentioning that she had worked until midnight for 3 straight days to meet that deadline, or that she had spent the weekend in bed recovering from the effort. Success, it seemed, was supposed to erase the memory of struggles. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon in early November. Sarah had been having a particularly difficult day, the kind where even sitting upright at her desk required conscious effort. She had managed to attend her morning meetings and complete some basic tasks, but by 2 o'clock, she knew she needed to go home. As she gathered her things, trying to move normally despite feeling like her joints were filled with sand, she noticed an elderly man in the lobby. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested military training. He wore a simple black coat and carried a briefcase, but something about his bearing commanded attention. Sarah was hurrying toward the elevator when she stumbled slightly, her body betraying her attempt to appear normal. The man noticed immediately and stepped forward. "Are you all right, miss?" His voice carried authority but also genuine concern. "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah replied automatically, the response she had perfected over months of hiding her condition. But the man's eyes, sharp blue and surprisingly kind, seemed to see through her facade. "No," he said quietly, "you're not fine. I know that look." Something in his tone made Sarah pause. Most people accepted her polite deflection and moved on, uncomfortable with the possibility that she might actually be struggling. This stranger seemed prepared to push deeper. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," she said, though part of her desperately wanted to understand what he meant. "You're fighting something that others can't see," he continued, his voice gentle but certain. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Trying to appear normal when your body feels like it's betraying you?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had described her experience so accurately? She looked at this stranger more closely, noting the way he stood with weight slightly favored on his left leg, the subtle tension around his eyes that suggested he was familiar with discomfort. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. "Because I've been where you are. Different battlefield, same war." He extended his hand. "General Richard Morrison, United States Army, retired." "And you are?" The name hit Sarah like lightning. "Morrison, as in Morrison and Associates?" She shook his hand, noticing the firm grip despite what she now realized were signs of his own physical challenges. "Sarah Matthews. I work for your company." General Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Matthews. That's interesting. Tell me, Sarah Matthews, did you happen to know a William Matthews? Served in Vietnam, later in Desert Storm?" Sarah's breath caught. "He was my grandfather." "How did you?" "Bill Matthews saved my life in 1991, General Morrison said simply. "More than once, actually. We served together in the 101st Airborne Division. He was the finest soldier I ever knew, and one of the best men I've ever met." The world seemed to tilt around Sarah. Her grandfather had mentioned serving with officers who had gone on to distinguished careers, but she had never connected those stories to her current situation. "I can't believe this. Grandpa died when I was 15, but he used to tell me stories about the soldiers who fought battles no one could see," General Morrison finished. "Bill told me about his granddaughter once. Said you were smart as a whip and strong as steel, but that you had a tender heart that felt everything deeply. He worried that the world might be too hard on someone with such sensitivity." Sarah felt the tears she had been holding back for weeks finally begin to fall. "He used to call me his little bird. He talked about you constantly. Showed me pictures. You have his eyes." General Morrison glanced around the busy lobby, then made a decision. "Sarah, I'd like to continue this conversation somewhere more private. Would you join me for coffee? I think there are things you need to know about your grandfather, and perhaps things I need to know about why you're fighting so hard to hide your pain." 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a quiet corner of a nearby cafe. General Morrison had ordered coffee, Sarah stuck with tea, her stomach too unsettled for anything stronger. She found herself studying his face, looking for traces of the man her grandfather might have been at that age. "Tell me what's been happening," General Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made telling the truth feel not just safe, but necessary. So Sarah told him everything. The mysterious pain that had started in college, the endless doctor appointments, the skeptical family members, the colleagues who thought she was faking, the performance improvement plan that felt like a countdown to professional failure. She told him about the isolation, the self-doubt, the days when she questioned her own reality. General Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as her story unfolded. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, his fingers drumming against his coffee cup. Your grandfather dealt with something similar, he said finally. Though in his case, it took us years to understand what was happening. Sarah felt her heart skip. What do you mean? After Desert Storm, Bill started having episodes. Days when he couldn't concentrate, when his body ached for no apparent reason, when simple tasks felt impossible. The military doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him. Some suggested it was PTSD, others thought he was malingering to avoid deployment. This was news to Sarah. Her grandfather had always seemed strong and capable in her memories, never mentioning ongoing health struggles. He never told you about Gulf War syndrome, did he? General Morrison continued. It wasn't officially recognized for years. Veterans came home with a constellation of symptoms: chronic pain, fatigue, cognitive difficulties, and, for the longest time, the medical establishment insisted it wasn't real. But it was real? Absolutely real. We lost good soldiers to it, not to enemy fire, but to a medical system that couldn't see past the surface. Bill was lucky. He had a strong support system and eventually found doctors who believed him. But I watched other veterans struggle alone, convinced they were going crazy because their pain didn't fit into neat diagnostic categories. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. That sounds exactly like what I'm going through. I suspect it is exactly what you're going through. Different causes, perhaps, but the same fundamental problem: invisible illness in a world that only believes what it can see. General Morrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed two young soldiers in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera despite the harsh environment around them. That's your grandfather and me in Kuwait, 1991. He was already starting to experience symptoms by then, though none of us understood what they meant. He pointed to William's arm, visible in the short-sleeved uniform. Do you see that? Sarah looked closer and gasped. On her grandfather's forearm was a tattoo she had never noticed in family photos, a semicolon with small wings, identical to the one on her own shoulder blade. I don't understand, she whispered. When did he get that? After we came home. He told me it represented a decision to continue his story when it would have been easier to end it. The wings were added later, when he finally found medical professionals who believed him and his symptoms began to improve. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder, where her own identical tattoo lay hidden beneath her sweater. This can't be a coincidence. Bill mentioned that tattoo in one of our last conversations before he passed away. He said he hoped someday you would understand what it meant, that the decision to keep going in the face of invisible suffering was the bravest choice a person could make. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical force. Her grandfather had been fighting the same battle she was fighting now. More than that, he had somehow known she would need the same symbol of resilience that had carried him through his darkest days. How is this possible? She asked. I got this tattoo on my 25th birthday. I designed it myself, or at least I thought I did. Your grandfather believed in connections that go deeper than conscious memory, General Morrison said gently. He used to say that sometimes we know things we don't remember learning, carry strength we don't remember inheriting. They sat in silence for several minutes, Sarah absorbing the magnitude of what she had learned. Her grandfather hadn't just been a strong man who had overcome challenges, he had been someone who understood her specific struggle in ways she was only now discovering. What happened to him? She asked finally. With his illness, I mean? He found a doctor at the VA who specialized in Gulf War syndrome. It took time, but they developed a treatment plan that helped manage his symptoms. More importantly, he found a community of veterans who understood what he was going through. The isolation ended, and, with it, much of the depression that had been making everything worse. He got better? He learned to live well with his condition. There's a difference. Bill never pretended the pain disappeared, but he found ways to work with it rather than against it. And he found purpose in helping other veterans who were facing similar challenges. General Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. Sarah, I want you to know that everything you're experiencing is real. Your pain is real. Your fatigue is real. Your cognitive difficulties are real. The fact that tests can't measure them doesn't make them less valid. The words Sarah had been desperately needing to hear finally came from someone whose opinion carried weight, someone who had known her grandfather, someone who understood both visible and invisible warfare. "But what do I do now?" she asked. "My job is in jeopardy. People think I'm faking. I'm running out of options." General Morrison smiled, and, for a moment, Sarah could see exactly the kind of leader her grandfather had followed into battle. "Now," he said, "you stop fighting alone. And you let me help you the way your grandfather once helped me." General Morrison's offer to help felt both like a lifeline and a dream too good to be true. Sarah had spent so long fighting alone that the concept of having a powerful ally seemed almost foreign. As they continued talking in the quiet cafe, she began to understand that this encounter was about to change everything. "The first thing we need to do," General Morrison said, pulling out a small notebook, "is get you connected with the right medical professionals. I know several doctors who specialize in conditions like yours, physicians who understand that the absence of obvious symptoms doesn't mean the absence of real illness." Sarah felt a flutter of hope mixed with caution. "I've seen so many doctors already. What makes you think these will be different?" "Because these doctors have worked with veterans who experienced Gulf War syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and other conditions that the medical establishment was slow to recognize. They've learned to listen with their ears instead of just their eyes." General Morrison wrote down several names and phone numbers, including Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the University Medical Center. Dr. Rodriguez was the physician who finally helped your grandfather get his symptoms under control. She's now one of the leading researchers in chronic pain conditions. I'm going to call her personally and explain your situation. The idea of someone advocating for her professionally felt almost overwhelming. For months, Sarah had been trying to navigate the medical system alone, facing skepticism and dismissal at every turn. Having someone with General Morrison's credibility making calls on her behalf could open doors she didn't even know existed. "There's something else we need to address," he continued, his expression becoming more serious. "Your employment situation. I understand you're under a performance improvement plan?" Sarah nodded, embarrassed to admit her professional struggles to someone who owned the company. "I know it looks bad. I've been trying to do my job well, but some days your body won't cooperate, no matter how determined your mind is," he finished. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about invisible illnesses. They don't follow convenient schedules. You can't just decide to feel better for an important meeting or push through symptoms because it's busy at work. But Janet and Patricia seem to think I should be able to control it better. They keep suggesting that it's a matter of attitude or stress management." General Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. Janet Williams has been managing people for 15 years, but she's never managed someone with a chronic illness. Patricia has a master's degree in human resources, but no training in disability accommodation. They're making decisions based on ignorance, not malice, but the result is the same. The way he spoke made it clear that he had already been thinking about this situation from multiple angles. Sarah realized that he hadn't stumbled upon her by accident in the lobby, he had been there for a specific purpose. "General Morrison, can I ask why you were at the office today?" He smiled slightly. "I try to visit periodically, even though I've been retired from active management for 5 years. The company still bears my name, and I like to keep an eye on how things are running. Today, I was meeting with Janet about some concerns I've had regarding employee wellness policies." "Concerns?" "Let's just say that a mutual friend had mentioned there might be someone in the company who was struggling with exactly the kind of situation your grandfather faced. Someone who needed an advocate." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "A mutual friend? Who?" General Morrison's eyes twinkled with something that might have been humor or might have been something deeper. "Your grandfather was a man who believed strongly in looking out for his people, even after he was gone. Sometimes I think he finds ways to make sure the right connections happen at the right time." The suggestion that her grandfather might somehow have orchestrated this meeting was both comforting and unsettling. Sarah had never been particularly spiritual, but the coincidences were starting to feel like something more than chance. "What happens next?" she asked. "Next, we fix this. But I need you to do something that's going to be difficult. I need you to be completely honest about your condition with your supervisors. No more hiding, no more trying to appear normal when you're not feeling well. The request terrified Sarah. Her entire strategy for the past year had been based on concealment and minimization. What if they use my honesty against me? What if admitting how bad things really are gives them more ammunition to fire me? Then, we'll deal with that when it happens. But, Sarah, hiding isn't working. It's making you sicker and putting your job at risk anyway. Sometimes the only way forward is through complete transparency. Over the next hour, General Morrison outlined a plan that was both comprehensive and intimidating. First, Sarah would get proper medical evaluation and documentation from Dr. Rodriguez. Second, they would formally request accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which would require the company to work with her condition rather than against it. Third, General Morrison would personally ensure that her supervisors received education about invisible illnesses and their legal obligations to provide support. This sounds like it could create a lot of workplace drama, Sarah said, imagining the reactions of her colleagues. It might, General Morrison admitted. But, you're already dealing with workplace drama. The difference is that now you'll be dealing with it from a position of strength instead of hiding and hoping things get better on their own. As they prepared to leave the cafe, General Morrison had one more surprise. There's something else your grandfather wanted you to have, though I suspect you'll find this as mysteriously coincidental as everything else today. He handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a silver bracelet with a simple charm, a semicolon with tiny wings, identical to her tattoo. He asked me to keep this until the right moment to give it to you. He said you would know when that moment arrived, and I would know too. Sarah stared at the bracelet, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The idea that her grandfather had somehow prepared for this exact situation, had known she would need this symbol and this support, was almost too much to process. How could he have known, she whispered. Bill Matthews was the most intuitive person I ever met. He could read situations and people in ways that seemed almost supernatural. He used to say that love creates connections that transcend normal limitations. Sarah put the bracelet on, feeling like she was accepting not just a piece of jewelry but a legacy of resilience and hope. What was he like? I mean, really like, when you served together? He was the kind of person who made everyone around him stronger. When soldiers were struggling, Bill somehow always knew exactly what they needed to hear. When missions got dangerous, he was the one people looked to for calm leadership. And, when he was dealing with his own illness later, he applied that same strength to helping other veterans navigate their medical challenges. I miss him so much. I wish he was here to help me figure this out. Sarah, he is here. Not in some mystical sense, though I wouldn't rule that out entirely. He's here in your DNA, in the strength you've inherited, in the way you keep fighting even when everything seems impossible. He's here in the fact that you got that tattoo without knowing he had the same one. And, he's here in the fact that you found me, or I found you, exactly when you needed an ally. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Rodriguez's office and was amazed when they offered her an appointment for the following week. When she mentioned General Morrison's referral, the receptionist's tone shifted to one of immediate accommodation. Clearly, the general's name carried significant weight in medical circles. She also called Jessica to update her on the day's extraordinary events. Her friend listened with amazement as Sarah described the meeting, the revelations about her grandfather, and the plan moving forward. This is incredible, Sarah. It's like the universe finally decided to give you a break. I'm scared, Jess. What if the doctors still can't find anything wrong? What if this doesn't work either? Then, at least you'll have tried with the best possible support system. But, Sarah, I think this is going to be different. You're not alone anymore. The weekend passed in a blur of research and preparation. Sarah read everything she could find about fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and other invisible illnesses. She organized her symptom documentation into a comprehensive timeline, noting patterns and triggers she hadn't previously recognized. Most importantly, she began practicing a different way of thinking about her condition. Instead of seeing her symptoms as failures or weaknesses, she started viewing them as her body's way of communicating important information. The pain wasn't an enemy to be defeated but a signal that required attention and accommodation. Monday morning arrived with the typical autumn chill that always made Sarah's joints ache more intensely. But, for the first time in months, she didn't try to hide her slow movements or force herself to appear energetic. Following General Morrison's advice, she decided to be authentic about her experience. "Good morning, Sarah," Janet said as she passed her desk. "How are you feeling today?" Instead of the usual fine, Sarah took a breath and answered honestly. "I'm having a high-pain day due to the weather change, but I'm here and ready to work within my capabilities." Janet looked slightly taken aback by the direct response, but also seemed to appreciate the honesty. "Is there anything you need to help manage your workload today?" The question was the first time anyone at Morrison and Associates had asked how they could support her rather than expressing frustration with her limitations. Sarah felt a small spark of hope that maybe, with the right approach, her workplace could become more accommodating. "I may need to take short breaks more frequently, and I work better on high-pain days if I can alternate between sitting and standing tasks." "Let's see what we can arrange," Janet said, and, to Sarah's amazement, she seemed genuinely interested in finding solutions rather than documenting problems. The shift in dynamics was small but noticeable. When Sarah moved more slowly during the morning team meeting, instead of feeling self-conscious and trying to compensate, she simply moved at the pace her body required. When she needed to stretch her back during a presentation, she did so without elaborate excuses. The response from colleagues was mixed but generally more positive than she had expected. Some seemed relieved that she was finally being direct about her challenges rather than creating mysterious explanations. Others appeared uncomfortable with the transparency, perhaps because it forced them to confront their own assumptions about illness and ability. Mark, the colleague who had previously questioned her commitment, actually approached her during lunch break. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I didn't understand what you were dealing with. My mother has rheumatoid arthritis, and she goes through something similar, looking fine one day and struggling the next. I should have been more supportive." The conversation was brief, but it represented a shift in perception that felt significant. Sarah began to understand that her secrecy had actually made it harder for people to empathize with her situation. By being honest about her challenges, she was giving others the opportunity to offer understanding and support. Tuesday brought her appointment with Dr. Rodriguez, and Sarah arrived at the medical center feeling more hopeful than she had in years. The office was different from the sterile, unwelcoming environments she had grown accustomed to. The waiting room featured comfortable seating, soft lighting, and informational brochures about various chronic conditions that acknowledged their reality and impact. When Dr. Rodriguez called her back, Sarah was immediately struck by the physician's warm, attentive demeanor. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the kind of presence that suggested extensive experience listening to difficult stories. "General Morrison told me about your situation, and about your grandfather," Dr. Rodriguez began. "Bill Matthews was one of my favorite patients. He had such determination to understand his condition and work with it constructively." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected connection to her grandfather's medical journey. "He never talked about being sick. I had no idea he was dealing with anything like what I'm going through." That was typical of his generation of veterans. They were taught to tough things out without complaining. But Bill eventually learned that acknowledging illness isn't the same as giving in to it. In fact, proper acknowledgement is often the first step toward effective management. Dr. Rodriguez spent nearly 2 hours with Sarah, asking detailed questions about her symptoms, her family history, her stress levels, and her daily activities. She performed a thorough physical examination and ordered several specialized tests that Sarah had never heard of before. "I suspect you're dealing with fibromyalgia, possibly complicated by some autoimmune factors," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The good news is that we have much better understanding and treatment options now than we did when your grandfather was first struggling with Gulf War syndrome. But what if the tests don't show anything conclusive? I've been through this so many times." Dr. Rodriguez smiled gently. "Sarah, fibromyalgia and similar conditions often don't show up on standard tests. That doesn't make them less real. We're going to approach this comprehensively, looking at sleep patterns, stress hormones, inflammatory markers, and neurological function. More importantly, we're going to start treatment based on your symptoms while we're gathering additional information. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah left a doctor's office feeling heard, believed, and hopeful. Dr. Rodriguez had prescribed a low-dose medication to help with sleep and pain management, recommended a specialized physical therapy program, and scheduled follow-up appointments to monitor progress. Most importantly, she had provided Sarah with detailed documentation of her condition, its likely impact on her work performance, and recommended accommodations that would allow her to function effectively in a professional environment. Armed with this medical validation, Sarah felt ready for the next phase of General Morrison's plan, the formal conversation with her supervisors about accommodation needs and her rights under disability law. As she drove home from the appointment, Sarah touched the semicolon bracelet her grandfather had somehow known she would need. For the first time since her symptoms began, she felt like she wasn't walking this path alone. The battles that no one else could see were still there, but now she had allies who understood that invisible wars required real strategies and real support. The transformation was just beginning, but Sarah could sense that her life was about to change in ways she had never dared to hope for. The meeting that would change everything was scheduled for Thursday morning. Sarah arrived at Morrison & Associates feeling nervous but determined, carrying Dr. Rodriguez's comprehensive medical documentation in a manila folder. General Morrison had insisted on attending the meeting personally, which had caused quite a stir in the administrative offices. "I've never seen Janet so flustered," whispered Rebecca from accounting as Sarah waited in the conference room. She spent all morning researching disability accommodation laws. Sarah tried to find comfort in that information, though part of her worried that last-minute research might lead to defensive rather than collaborative responses. She had spent the previous evening practicing what she wanted to say, focusing on solutions rather than just problems. General Morrison arrived first, looking every inch the distinguished military leader despite his retirement. He carried himself with quiet authority and greeted Sarah warmly, asking about her appointment with Dr. Rodriguez and expressing satisfaction with the initial treatment plan. "Remember," he said quietly as they waited for the others, "you're not asking for charity or special treatment. You're requesting reasonable accommodations that will allow you to do your job effectively. That's not just your right, it's good business sense." Janet and Patricia entered together, both looking slightly uncomfortable. Sarah noticed they had brought a thick folder of their own, presumably containing research about their legal obligations and company policies. "Thank you all for making time for this important conversation," General Morrison began, taking charge of the meeting with natural ease. "We're here to discuss Sarah's medical condition and the accommodations that will help her continue contributing effectively to this company." Patricia cleared her throat. "General Morrison, we appreciate your concern, but this is really a matter for HR and Sarah's direct supervisor to handle." "Actually," General Morrison replied calmly, "as the founder of this company and someone who has dealt extensively with invisible illness accommodations for veterans, I think my perspective might be valuable. But, more importantly, Sarah's grandfather saved my life on multiple occasions. I consider it both an honor and an obligation to ensure his granddaughter receives the support she needs." The room fell silent. Sarah hadn't expected General Morrison to invoke her grandfather so directly, but the effect was immediate. Janet's expression shifted from administrative concern to something more personal, and even Patricia seemed to recognize that this wasn't a typical HR situation. Sarah took a deep breath and began presenting her case. She explained her condition using Dr. Rodriguez's documentation, describing fibromyalgia as a neurological disorder that affected pain processing, sleep, and cognitive function. She outlined how it had developed gradually, why it had been difficult to diagnose, and how it affected her daily life. "The key thing to understand," she said, referencing notes she had prepared, "is that this is a variable condition. Some days I function normally, other days I need accommodations. The unpredictability has made it hard for me to ask for help, because I never knew when I would need it." Janet leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Sarah, I have to admit, this explains a lot about the patterns we've been seeing in your work performance. Why didn't you tell us this sooner?" "Because I was afraid you wouldn't believe me," Sarah answered honestly. "I look healthy, my tests were often normal, and even some of my doctors were skeptical. I thought if I could just push through it, maybe it would get better on its own." General Morrison nodded approvingly at her honesty. Sarah's experience is unfortunately common among people with invisible illnesses. The instinct is to hide the condition rather than seek accommodation, which often makes the situation worse for everyone involved. Patricia consulted her folder. We've researched the ADA requirements, and it seems like there are several accommodations we could implement. Flexible scheduling, ergonomic workspace modifications, the ability to work from home when needed. Those would all be helpful, Sarah said, feeling hopeful about Patricia's tone. But I think the most important accommodation would be understanding from my supervisors and colleagues that my productivity might vary from day to day, even though my commitment to the work remains constant. That's reasonable, Janet agreed. We've all seen that your work quality is excellent when you're feeling well. If we can find ways to support you during the more difficult periods, it benefits everyone. The conversation continued for another hour, with all parties working collaboratively to develop an accommodation plan. Sarah would have flexible start times, access to ergonomic equipment, permission to work from home when symptoms were severe, and modified deadlines that accounted for the variable nature of her condition. More importantly, Janet and Patricia committed to educating the rest of the team about invisible illnesses, helping create a more supportive work environment for Sarah and, potentially, other employees who might be struggling with similar issues. As the meeting wound down, General Morrison made one final comment that surprised everyone. I want to add something that goes beyond Sarah's individual situation. This company was built by veterans, many of whom dealt with service-related health issues that weren't always visible or well understood. Moving forward, I'd like Morrison and Associates to become a model for how businesses can support employees with invisible illnesses. What would that look like? Janet asked. Training for managers about disability accommodation, partnerships with medical providers who understand these conditions, and a company culture that values transparency about health challenges rather than punishing people for having them. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what General Morrison was proposing. Not only was he helping her personally, but he was using her situation as a catalyst for broader organizational change. After the meeting, Sarah walked with General Morrison to the lobby where they had first met just 2 weeks earlier. The space looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. Instead of hurrying through in pain and hiding her struggles, Sarah moved at her natural pace, wearing her grandfather's bracelet openly and feeling supported rather than isolated. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I can't believe how much has changed. The hard work is just beginning, General Morrison replied. Managing a chronic condition is a lifelong process, and there will be setbacks along with progress. But you're not facing it alone anymore. Over the following weeks, Sarah began implementing Dr. Rodriguez's treatment plan while adjusting to her new workplace accommodations. The medication helped stabilize her sleep patterns, which had a cascading effect on her pain levels and cognitive function. The physical therapy taught her exercises that helped manage symptoms proactively rather than just reacting to flare-ups. Most importantly, the change in her work environment reduced the stress that had been exacerbating her physical symptoms. Instead of spending energy hiding her condition, she could focus that energy on doing good work within her capabilities. Her colleagues' reactions were mixed but generally positive. Mark became one of her strongest supporters, often checking in to see if she needed assistance with physically demanding tasks. Rebecca from accounting shared that she had been dealing with her own invisible health issue and felt encouraged by Sarah's openness. A few employees remained skeptical, making occasional comments about special treatment or convenient illnesses. But their voices were increasingly outnumbered by those who appreciated the education they received about disability accommodation and the more inclusive environment it created. 3 months after the accommodation meeting, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Rodriguez. I've been following your progress, and I'm impressed with how well you're managing your condition, the doctor said. I wanted to ask if you might be interested in sharing your story with other patients who are just beginning this journey. What do you mean? I'm starting a support group for people with fibromyalgia and similar conditions. Many of my patients struggle with the same isolation and self-doubt you experienced. Having someone who has successfully navigated workplace accommodation and found effective treatment could be incredibly valuable. Sarah considered the request carefully. Public speaking had never been her strength, and sharing personal medical information with strangers felt intimidating. But she thought about her grandfather and his commitment to helping fellow veterans, about General Morrison's dedication to creating systemic change, and about her own desperate wish for role models when she had been struggling alone. "I'd like to try," she said finally. The first support group meeting was held in the comfortable conference room at Dr. Rodriguez's medical practice. 8 people attended, ranging in age from 22 to 68, all dealing with various forms of chronic pain and fatigue. Sarah shared her story, focusing on the journey from isolation to advocacy, from hiding to seeking accommodation. "The hardest part," she told the group, "was learning to believe my own experience even when other people doubted it. For years, I let other people's skepticism convince me that maybe I was exaggerating or making things up." A young man named David raised his hand. "How did you get past that?" "I'm dealing with the same thing at my job, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe I am just weak or lazy." Sarah touched her grandfather's bracelet, feeling the connection to his strength and resilience. "I learned that invisible battles are still real battles. Just because other people can't see what you're fighting doesn't make the fight any less valid or courageous." The group sessions became a monthly commitment that Sarah looked forward to. Helping others navigate their own accommodation requests and medical journeys gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond her individual recovery. She began to understand what Dr. Rodriguez had meant about her grandfather's dedication to helping fellow veterans. There was something powerful about turning personal struggle into community support. 6 months after meeting General Morrison, Sarah received a promotion at Morrison & Associates. Her supervisor role included responsibility for developing the company's new disability inclusion program, building on the foundation that General Morrison had established. "I can't think of anyone better qualified to lead this initiative," Janet said during the promotion announcement. "You've shown us what's possible when we approach accommodation as an opportunity rather than an obligation." Sarah's new role involved consulting with other companies about best practices for supporting employees with invisible illnesses. She found herself frequently telling her grandfather's story alongside her own, explaining how military veterans had paved the way for civilian understanding of conditions that don't present obvious external symptoms. One evening, while preparing a presentation for a corporate wellness conference, Sarah called her mother for the first time in months. Their relationship had been strained during the worst of her illness, when Linda's suggestions about pushing through it felt more like criticism than support. "Mom, I need to tell you about something that happened with Grandpa's service record," Sarah began, and then shared the entire story, meeting General Morrison, learning about her grandfather's struggles with Gulf War syndrome, discovering the connection between their identical tattoos. Linda was quiet for a long time. "I never knew Dad was dealing with health problems after the war. He never said anything to us. That was common for his generation. But, Mom, the reason I'm calling is to tell you that I understand why you encouraged me to push through the pain. You were trying to help me be strong the way Grandpa was strong. But I've learned there's a difference between pushing through and finding sustainable ways to work with your body." "I'm sorry I wasn't more supportive," Linda said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought if you focused less on the pain, it might hurt less. I didn't understand that acknowledging it was actually the first step toward managing it." The conversation marked the beginning of healing in Sarah's family relationships. Her parents began attending some of her support group meetings, learning about fibromyalgia from Dr. Rodriguez and other medical professionals. Robert even volunteered to help with a veteran support program that addressed invisible injuries from military service. A year after that first encounter in the lobby, Sarah stood before an audience of 300 business leaders at the National Workplace Inclusion Conference. She wore a professional blazer that she had deliberately chosen to show her grandfather's semicolon bracelet, and her presentation slides included the photo General Morrison had shown her, her grandfather and the general in Kuwait, both displaying their matching tattoos. "Invisible illnesses affect 1 in 4 working adults," she told the audience, "but most of our workplace policies were designed for visible disabilities that follow predictable patterns." When we expand our understanding of what accommodation looks like, we don't just help people with chronic conditions, we create more flexible, human-centered work environments that benefit everyone. After her presentation, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "I have lupus, and I've been hiding it at work for 2 years. Listening to your story gives me hope that maybe I don't have to do this alone." Sarah gave her Dr. Rodriguez's contact information and her own business card. You don't have to do it alone. There are people who understand, and there are ways to make it work. That evening, General Morrison took Sarah to dinner to celebrate the success of her presentation. At 82, he moved more slowly than he had when they first met, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment to helping others unwavering. Your grandfather would be proud, he said as they clinked glasses in a toast to invisible warriors everywhere. I think about him every day, Sarah replied. Not just about his strength, but about his ability to see connections that other people missed. The fact that he somehow knew I would need this exact symbol, at this exact time in my life, still amazes me. Bill believed that love creates bonds that transcend normal limitations of time and space. He used to say that when we help each other through difficult passages, we're participating in something larger than individual survival. Sarah looked down at her bracelet, then, at the photo on her phone of the support group that had grown to include 23 regular members. She thought about the dozens of companies that had contacted her about implementing inclusion programs, the medical students who attended her lectures about patient advocacy, the families who had found hope in her story. I think I understand what you mean about participating in something larger, she said. When I was sick and hiding it, I felt like I was the only person in the world dealing with invisible illness. Now I realize we're everywhere, we just needed permission to stop hiding. 2 years later, Sarah married David, the young man she had met in her first support group meeting. Their wedding featured veterans from General Morrison's military network, patients from Dr. Rodriguez's practice, and colleagues from companies across the country who had implemented disability inclusion programs. But the most meaningful moment came when Sarah's father read a letter that had been found among her grandfather's papers after his death, sealed with instructions that it should be opened when little bird learns to use her wings. My dearest Sarah, the letter read, if you are reading this, it means you have discovered that the battles no one can see are often the most important ones to fight. I hope by now you have learned what took me too long to understand, that asking for help is not weakness, that accommodation is not defeat, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop trying to prove your strength to people who never learned how to recognize it. The bracelet I left for you contains a secret I never told anyone while I was alive. The wings on our matching symbol don't represent the hope of flying away from our struggles. They represent the moment when we realize our struggles can teach us to fly higher than we ever imagined possible. Use your pain to build bridges for others who are walking this path. Use your healing to light the way for those still lost in the darkness. Use your voice to speak for those who haven't yet found the courage to speak for themselves. You were always meant to soar, little bird. I just had to make sure you had the right equipment when the time came. As Sarah finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the wedding venue. General Morrison stood and raised his glass for a toast that honored not just the newlyweds, but the invisible warriors everywhere who keep fighting battles that others cannot see. To Sarah and David, he said, and to all who have learned that the decision to continue your story when it would be easier to end it is the most courageous choice anyone can make. May you always remember that your struggles are real, your accommodations are valid, and your voices are needed. The semicolon tattoo on Sarah's shoulder had originally represented a pause in her story when she could have ended it. But, as she looked around at the community of support she had built and been embraced by, Sarah realized it had evolved into something more powerful, a symbol of continuation, connection, and the revolutionary act of refusing to let invisible suffering remain unspoken. In helping others find their voices, she had discovered her own true purpose. And, in that discovery, her grandfather's greatest hope for her had finally been realized.